Bonjour et bienvenue à toutes et à tous. Hello and welcome everyone to this inaugural plenary session. I'm Simon Mundy, the Moral Money editor at the Financial Times and author of the climate book Race for Tomorrow. And I'm delighted to be joined here by a really top quality panel to discuss one of the most important and controversial subjects in the modern economy, which is how we can truly and effectively lead this transition to a greener economy. And it's been quite fascinating for me over the past few years as a financial journalist to see how quickly the conversation has moved on this subject. If you remember, 10 years ago, the word net zero was not on anybody's lips. And the green transition was far from the center of the conversation when it came to politics or indeed business. And it was striking for me when I was at COP26 in Glasgow last year to see the enormous influx of business leaders who are now falling over each other to set out very ambitious goals for their transition and their contribution to the global transition. And yet, speaking to various other people on the ground, notably delegates from developing countries, youth climate activists, there is tremendous skepticism about how serious our leaders, be they in the private sector or the public sector, truly are about achieving the goals that they've set out. So that's what we're going to be discussing here today, how we can make serious progress towards these goals. So I'm delighted to be joined by Patrick Martin, who is the President Delegate of the Mouvement des entreprises de France. We also have Pablo Hernández de Cos, who's the Governor of the Banco de España and also Chairman of the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. Boon, who is the Chief Executive of SGX Group. Tshabalala, the Group CEO of Standard Bank Group from South Africa. And Odile Renaud-Basso, who is the President of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Welcome, everyone. So, Odile, I'd like to start with you. And coming back to this question of the discussions at COP26 and what has happened since then. There were some important signs of progress at COP26. Also, many people were left very disappointed by some of the things that did not happen. And since then, well, a lot has happened, and not all of it good by any means. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has caused incredible turmoil in the energy market, and it's really changed the conversation around what we can expect and what is happening right now when it comes to the energy transition. There are some who say this is accelerating things in a certain way, the move away from fossil fuels. There are some who say that it's a real setback on that front. Now, clearly the war is a tragedy on multiple levels, but if we look at what it means for the energy transition specifically, what's your take on that, Odile?
Thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me and having me participating to this very important debate on a very topical issue. And my take on the impact of the war on the green transition is, first of all, that this war, which is absolutely dramatic, has really put at the forefront the notion of energy security, which was not so much in everybody's mind before. So everybody now is focusing on energy security, plus on the huge impact of the shock on energy price on the overall economies, and in particular in Europe, but I mean, globally also, we can see that, I mean, that's where the risk of really shortage of quantity. And I think what it showed, I think in the very short term, the war has as a consequence, very immediate consequence, the fact that some countries are going back to coal, are extending the lifetime of coal as an energy, are looking for alternative options to buy gas from elsewhere than Russia, and so in the very short term, it may give the impression that it distract the policymakers, companies, and so forth from the transition. But on the other hand, I think the huge impact and the huge increase of energy price and so forth make the need for the green transition and economic case for green transition even more rapid. And that's true for the price effect, but also, as I was saying, the energy security challenge, which is when you think about what can be done to address energy security. Of course, you have diversification of source of energy, but also development of renewable, because renewable is much more into the remit, under the control of a country, and also energy efficiency. So in a way, even if in the short term you have this prolongation of coal, and which is something we need to deal with, and I guess to accept in a way, because it's needed in a very short term, but in the medium to longer term, it's clear that what's going on in the energy market with the war will have as an impact to accelerate the green transition.
Thank you so much, Odile. Now, of course, the war is happening in the east of Europe, but its impacts are being felt all over the world, including in Africa, Sim. So you are an enormous economic force in South Africa, in one of the world's major developing economies, but also with operations all over Africa. How do you see the events of recent months playing out in Africa? How are the prospects for the energy transition developing on that continent?
So, Simon, thank you very much. It's a great privilege to be amongst this august group of people. So thank you for the opportunity. I think what we're seeing on the continent is exactly what one would expect, which is high prices for a set of substitutes for oil, gas, and coal. So all of these things are substitutes for one another, and one is seeing an increase in their prices. In South Africa's case, we're seeing terms of trade and balance of payments are being very positive and constituting a positive shock for us off the back of the increase in the price of coal. So while you're having an increase in oil, you're having the price of coal accelerating faster than the price of oil. And so countries that don't have an automatic stabilizer like South Africa would have, for example, tend to be advantaged. So, exporters of fuel and some are disadvantaged, such as importers of fuel. We think, Simon, that over the medium to long term, the outlook is going to get even more complicated. And because one doesn't just look at the variables in the trade basket, but also the geopolitical positioning of the various countries and particular regions. And then, of course, there's the technological changes. I do think that a number of things for Africa would be relevant. First, we'd want to see more financial support for energy transition in developing countries. Again, off the back of what is happening globally. We'd want to see, that COP27 continues the process of developing a single taxonomy of green transition and brown assets, which I think is something that you're going to want us to debate a bit later. And hopefully we're going to end up with a single set of disclosure requirements. And financial institutions, I think, could do a lot more to mitigate climate change if there was a more widely accepted understanding of what constitutes a transition project. And so the events happening in Eurasia have actually accelerated processes, I think, Simon, that were happening prior to these events. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sim. It's really interesting to hear your sense that certainly, to an important extent, it's accelerating some sorts of action. Patrick, turning to you, I think for us journalists, it's often tempting to always focus on the biggest companies, but most of the economy is constituted by small and medium-sized companies. These are the real drivers of the economy in many ways. And among your members, you do have large companies in there, but most of your members who you represent are SMEs. And it's incredibly important for us to understand the challenges that they face and how all of this looks to them. How are they trying to lead the green transition? And what are the real challenges that they face when trying to do so?
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je voudrais commencer par vous dire que je suis très heureux d'intervenir à nouveau devant cette conférence de Montréal. Saluer amicalement Nicolas Remillère et très respectueusement Paul Desmarais. Effectivement, le Mouvement des entreprises de France, le MEDEF, réunit 190 000 entreprises de toute taille dans tous les secteurs d'activité qui emploient de l'ordre de 9,5 millions de salariés. Donc on a un bon échantillon très représentatif de ce qu'est l'économie française. Alors ce que je peux vous affirmer à ce jour, c'est que les chefs d'entreprise français, dorénavant, sont convaincus que la perspective d'une économie décarbonée est incontournable. Ils le sont pour la plupart d'entre eux dorénavant de leur plein gré, avec conviction, avec enthousiasme parfois. Et puis pour d'autres, ils le sont sous la contrainte parce qu'ils sont désormais parfaitement conscients que ce qu'on appelle les parties prenantes, les financiers, les clients, les salariés, l'environnement d'une manière générale, de toute façon, leur interdit de se dérober. Il n'y a plus en France de chefs d'entreprise dits climato-sceptiques, c'est-à-dire qui remettent en cause toutes ces analyses assez impressionnantes, assez angoissantes dont nous disposons dorénavant sur les phénomènes climatiques et leur dangerosité. Alors, la France bénéficie d'un certain nombre d'atouts remarquables. D'abord, il faut souligner, le Premier ministre l'a fait tout à l'heure s'agissant du Québec et du Canada, il faut souligner que l'économie française est la plus décarbonée du monde. On a 3% du PIB mondial, on a 0,7 à 0,8% d'émissions de gaz à effet de serre. Ça tient pour beaucoup à un atout remarquable qu'a la France, qui est son parc nucléaire, lequel parc nucléaire souffre un petit peu en ce moment, mais ça nous dote en matière de disponibilité de l'énergie, de décarbonation de l'énergie et de souveraineté, un atout absolument remarquable. Et puis par ailleurs, nous avons quelques leaders qui peuvent tirer parti de cette transition environnementale. Je ne vais pas les citer, mais Engie figure ici. J'ai parlé du nucléaire, donc d'EDF. Voilà, on a un certain nombre d'acteurs majeurs, mais on a également beaucoup de PME, beaucoup d'entreprises de taille intermédiaire. Ma propre entreprise, qui réalise à peu près 1 milliard d'euros de chiffre d'affaires, est directement concernée. On a beaucoup d'entreprises qui savent pouvoir tirer parti, en définitive, de cette transition. Il n'en demeure pas moins qu'on doit relever un certain nombre de défis. Odile Renaud-Basso a signalé il y a quelques instants encore combien la situation géopolitique, mais également sanitaire, télescopait en quelque sorte des stratégies qui tendent vers la neutralité carbone. Il est évident que quand on voit les choix qu'opère l'Allemagne, qui est le premier partenaire économique de la France en matière d'énergie, ça vient un petit peu contredire, prendre à contre-pied les stratégies dont nous avons besoin, singulièrement sur le plan de l'énergie. Il y a un deuxième facteur que les chefs d'entreprise français prennent en compte parce qu'ils sont directement concernés, mais également parce qu'ils voient leurs citoyens, leurs concitoyens, qui est celui de l'acceptabilité et de la trajectoire des stratégies que nous mettons en œuvre. Nous avons eu en France un phénomène dont tout le monde n'a peut-être pas connaissance ici, qui est le phénomène dit des gilets jaunes, c'est-à-dire toute une partie de la population qui s'est en quelque sorte mis en insurrection au moment où le prix du carburant, le prix de l'essence et du gasoil ont été majorés il y a maintenant 3 ans. Et ça a déstabilisé le pays pendant plusieurs semaines de manière y compris assez violente. Mais il y a également des effets pour les entreprises elles-mêmes. De la même manière qu'on apprécie, on estime à l'heure actuelle qu'il y a 4 millions d'emplois en France sur 20 millions, 22 millions dans le secteur privé qui vont être remis en cause par cette nécessaire transition. Il y a beaucoup de capital qui va être détruit de la même manière. Il y a beaucoup de chefs d'entreprise qui n'ont pas démérité, qui depuis des décennies investissent de manière vertueuse dans certaines industries, je pense en particulier à la sous-traitance automobile, et qui savent qu'à court terme, leur patrimoine, en définitive, autant que les emplois de leurs salariés, vont être remis en cause. On se doit d'intégrer cette dimension et de l'accompagner. Après, on doit s'inscrire dans une véritable stratégie, et je dirais une planification. C'est un peu contre nature que le mouvement des entreprises de France, qui a une doctrine libérale, rejoigne cette conviction qu'il faut planifier les choses. Il n'y a rien de pire, en définitive, sur le plan des technologies, mais également sur le plan de l'économie, que de devoir, de jour en jour, en tout cas de mois en mois et d'année en année, avoir des revirements en matière de réglementation, de législation, d'objectifs parfois. Donc nous sommes dorénavant demandeurs de cette planification, et que cette planification se fonde sur la neutralité technologique. On a en Europe une certaine propension du politique et de l'administration à vouloir tout réglementer. En réalité, il nous faut raisonner en termes d'objectifs, la neutralité carbone, plus que de technologie, parce que, et tant mieux d'ailleurs, dorénavant la technologie, singulièrement quand on parle d'énergie, la technologie évolue extrêmement vite. On ne sait pas ce que seront ou pas demain les petits réacteurs nucléaires, et ainsi de suite. L'hydrogène, on a encore beaucoup d'interrogations, l'hydrogène décarboné. Voilà, donc il faut qu'on ait un cadre, mais qu'on puisse en quelque sorte naviguer, que les acteurs économiques, mais également les scientifiques puissent naviguer, tendu vers un objectif partagé de neutralité carbone, mais en laissant à l'initiative privée, en laissant aux chercheurs la possibilité de s'adapter en permanence. Ça n'est pas à l'heure actuelle la doctrine de l'Union européenne qui est très dirigiste sur le plan des technologies. Et puis enfin, il y a un enjeu considérable qui est celui du financement de cette transition. Dans le débat public européen, dans le débat public français, qui a été très intense ces derniers temps avec les élections présidentielles et législatives, il y a une espèce d'angle mort sur ce que coûtera cette transition et derrière cela, qui supportera ces coûts. Alors le MEDEF a fait réaliser des études, nos homologues allemands du BDI ont fait la même chose, et de ces études ressort que pour les entreprises françaises, il faudra investir de l'ordre de 35 à 40 milliards d'euros de plus chaque année jusqu'en 2030 et probablement jusqu'en 2050 pour atteindre cette économie décarbonée qu'à nouveau nous appelons de nos voeux. Mon propos n'est pas du tout de dire que nous sommes dans le déni, que nous sommes dans l'esquive, que nous sommes dans la résistance passive, nous sommes très déterminés. Mais il va falloir trouver ces 35 à 40 milliards d'euros, c'est-à-dire, pour bien situer les choses, de l'ordre de 10 à 15% d'investissements supplémentaires pour les entreprises françaises, avec de grosses disparités, bien sûr, d'un secteur d'activité à l'autre, de sorte que, dans l'ordre et de manière financée, nous atteignions ces objectifs. Ça sera la même chose pour les ménages, pour les particuliers, qui devront eux aussi consacrer des investissements importants, qui à la rénovation thermique de son logement, qui au changement de son véhicule. Et donc le MEDEF s'emploie à rationaliser, à objectiver ce débat qui, pour l'instant, comme c'est souvent le cas en France, est un petit peu théorique, est un petit peu hors sol. Voilà, nous sommes des chefs d'entreprise, il nous appartient de poser objectivement, rationnellement les choses. Nous l'avons fait. En regard, c'est vrai que la situation de rentabilité des entreprises françaises, même si elle s'est améliorée, n'atteint pas des records ni européens ni mondiaux, donc avec des capacités d'autofinancement qui, à ce jour, permettent difficilement d'engager ces 35 à 40 milliards d'euros d'investissement supplémentaires par an. L'état des finances publiques lui-même est assez tendu. On a un gros point d'interrogation pour savoir si l'Union européenne, comme elle l'a fait dans le cadre de la pandémie Covid, voudra et saura mobiliser des ressources pour accompagner les économies de l'Union européenne vers cette transition environnementale. Voilà, donc ça c'est un point d'interrogation important et nous sommes demandeurs que la sphère publique, singulièrement l'État français, se réinvente à certains égards pour se libérer des marges de manœuvre en la matière. Et puis il y a un dernier enjeu qui vous parlera à tous, qui est celui de l'équité dans la compétition économique internationale. Alors déjà au sein de l'Union européenne, mais entre l'Union européenne et le reste du monde. J'ai rappelé tout à l'heure les bonnes performances environnementales de la France. Il s'agit d'aller plus loin encore, mais il ne faut pas que, comme on dit en français, nous mourions en bonne santé. C'est-à-dire qu'en étant extrêmement vertueux, et il le faut sur ce plan environnemental, nous soyons parmi les seuls au monde à investir cet argent, à détruire du capital, à détruire des emplois qu'il va falloir reconvertir en parallèle. Et donc ça, c'est au niveau de l'Union européenne que ça doit se discuter, avec des avancées récentes, notamment sur le mécanisme d'ajustement carbone aux frontières. Se posent des questions fondamentales de compatibilité avec les règles de l'OCDE, qui régissent le commerce international, et le souci des entrepreneurs français, des entrepreneurs européens, c'est qu'en engageant tout ce virage fondamental, nous ne nous disqualifions pas par rapport à nos grands concurrents, qui peuvent être asiatiques, qui peuvent être nord-américains aussi. Donc nous avons un beau sujet devant nous, mais l'essentiel n'est pas là. L'essentiel, c'est que dorénavant, les chefs d'entreprise français savent qu'ils iront vers la neutralité carbone dans une logique de croissance. Pardon, je suis un peu long, je finis là-dessus. Nous avons, mais je crois que c'est vrai à travers le monde, en tout cas dans une bonne partie du monde, nous avons un débat de fond qui est celui de la croissance versus la décroissance. Nous, notre conviction, c'est qu'il nous faut toujours créer de la richesse, la créer de manière plus frugale, la créer de manière décarbonée, mais que si nous nous inscrivons dans une logique de décroissance, singulièrement en Europe, encore plus en France, nous n'arriverons plus à financer notre modèle social qui repose à tort ou à raison sur des transferts sociaux massifs, et que nous ne saurons pas non plus financer les investissements colossaux qu'il va falloir engager sur l'innovation, et singulièrement sur l'innovation environnementale.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Some important points there. So turning to you, Governor de Cos, it's been very interesting for me to see the scale of voluntary private sector-led initiatives in the financial sector, of course, GFANs notably, which really came together at COP26. But you have concerns that are raised in some quarters that we have an excessive emphasis on voluntary initiatives within the financial sector and not enough emphasis on action being taken by regulators and supervisors. Now, obviously, in your role as head of the Basel Committee, you are heavily involved in that latter side of things. What should people be aware of in terms of the action that is happening and that will happen on the regulatory and supervisory side of things in the financial sector with a view to driving forward this green transition?
Yeah, thank you very much, Simon. And of course, thank you also for the organizers for inviting me to be in this very important conference. Well, maybe I should start by emphasizing the perspective, the dimension that we take at the Basel Committee, or more in general, when dealing with this issue from a supervisory perspective, which is basically our mandate. Our mandate is financial stability, trying to guarantee financial stability. So if I talk as chairman of the Basel Committee, the perspective that I'm taking is in trying to guarantee financial stability of the banking sector. And I think this is important to have in mind when discussing this topic. Then maybe it's also important to emphasize as a starting point what we already know about climate change and the connection with the banking sector, which is basically that whether through transition risk, whether through physical risk, we know that this risk can materialize and can undermine the balance sheets of the banking sector. And this is why the main approach and the main intention, the main goal that we are having at the Basel Committee table is precisely to try to guarantee that banks take into account this risk in the risk framework, meaning that they incorporate this as an additional risk together with the more traditional risk that we always talk about. This is precisely what we are doing. Entering into more details, what we have done at the Basel Committee is precisely to look at our supervisory practices, our regulation as well, and our disclosure initiatives in order precisely to try to force the banking sector to incorporate this risk in a proper manner, and very important from our perspective also in a homogeneous manner, because as you were saying, Simon, it was also mentioned by Patrick, we are talking of a global problem, and there is only one potential solution for this, which is, of course, having a global solution as well. And in particular, when talking about the financial stability implications, we know that if there is no homogeneous way of tackling this issue for the banking sector in particular, and there is heterogeneity in how this is being tackled by different jurisdictions, in the end, the public good, the global public good of financial stability won't be achieved. So as to be more concrete, let me mention, for example, what we've done. We just published last Friday in Europe, the ECB kind of stress test that I think illustrates very well how supervisory authorities are approaching this problem. So we took 104 significant banks, and we asked them basically three things. First, we asked them about how they are incorporating stress testing, climate stress testing internally within the banking sector. We also asked them what is, try to measure, we advise them to force to measure the reliance on carbon emitting sector. And then finally, we also perform and ask them what the impact of different scenarios over several time horizons might have for the banking sector. No? And well, the process of this, we are still in a learning process with the banking sector, but I think it's already very interesting, the results that were published. Let me just say that, for example, related to these stress testing capabilities, the results of what we published show that around 60% of banks do not yet have a climate stress testing framework, and similarly, most banks do not include climate risk in their credit risk models, and just 20% consider climate risk as a variable when granting loans. So I mean, it's true that we have already achieved something here, but there is still much more to be done. On this second module, this was the wording that we use on trying to measure the reliance of banks on carbon emitting sectors. Also, the numbers were quite relevant in the sense that, for example, almost two-thirds is a big number of banks' income from non-financial corporate customers stems from greenhouse gas intensive industries. No? So again, the dependency on these potentially affected sectors, in particular by climate transition, could also be very relevant, and of course from this through banks. And on the stress test, well, perhaps the main number that I can give, that was also published in our press release last Friday, is basically that the stress test show that credit and market losses in the short-term disorderly transition scenario, because we asked them for trying to measure the implications of a disorderly transition scenario, and the two physical risk scenarios that were also defined homogeneously for all banks amount to around 70 billion euros on aggregate for the 41 banks in question, because this was an exercise that was done with a rather small number of banks, because we knew that from the very beginning that it was a relatively difficult exercise. So all in all, Simon, I think we have to take this very, very seriously, that we are taking this very, very seriously from the global perspective, from the European perspective, from both perspectives. That I think we have already done some work, that banks have already done part of the job, but that there is still a lot to be done in order precisely to guarantee that the implications of climate change for financial stability are adequately measured and adequately mitigated at the global level.
Thank you. Yes, you certainly have a lot of work on your plate. Boon, turning to you, having spent most of my career in Asia, I'm really interested to hear your updated perspective on the situation in that part of the world, because people often talk about Asia as being both a source of great potential progress when it comes to tackling climate change, but also a lot of risk when we look at the economic growth that is happening and needs to happen in countries like India. That could come with a lot of associated emissions. Similarly, China is still building coal power plants, even as it's driving forward progress in various green industries. What is the best way to look at the green transition in Asia? Is Asia leading the green transition, in your opinion? How can other parts of the world help Asia to do still better and move still faster in its green transition?
Well, first, thanks, Simon, and special mention to the organizers for inviting me. As you said, Asia contributes almost half of the world's total greenhouse gas emission. So in order to achieve the global ambition for a net zero future, Asia has to make scalable impact in climate change. And for Southeast Asia, over 50% of its GDP comes from the small and medium enterprises. So it is crucial that we transition these companies and also empower them in their sustainability journey. And the financial ecosystem, I think, can play a part. The financial ecosystem, together with exchanges like the XGX Group, can play an important role in facilitating capital flows to drive decarbonization and transition efforts. More certainly needs to be done but we need to recognize the challenges in balancing competing interests. Asia is also very diverse, and each country is at a different stage of economic and social development. Yes, there are big economies like China and Asia, but I think the challenge for Asia is to develop credible and practical net zero pathways that balances credible holistic transition with the region's diverse environmental, social, and economic needs. Just as Governor Pablo mentioned, the role of the Basel Committee, I think exchanges are in a unique position because we're at the center of the market ecosystem. We can help facilitate the flow of such capital, lots of commitments at COP26. I think we now need to see implementation. Hopefully that starts to formulate itself at COP27, because I think commitments have been made. We now really need to move forward. And you asked talk about the invasion of Ukraine earlier on. Clearly, that complicates matter. Near-term focus is really on energy security. So with Asia leading global growth in many more years to come, I think Asia can also take a leading role in the green economy and in the transition to net zero. So I'm actually fairly sanguine on the medium to long-term perspective. And the green investments in this part of the world has certainly picked up. The majority of it is going to renewables and also in the built environment. But let's also recognize that on the flip side, there's still a large emission gap of almost close to 3 gigatons versus what's been set in terms of 2030 targets. So this needs everybody hands on deck. And I think the ecosystem between government, private sector, companies, and individuals all need to come together.
Thank you. Yes, getting that balance right of the respective roles to be played by those various groups is the key. And as you mentioned, we're now only a few months away from COP27, and there are various people who will say, well, look, this is going to be a different sort of COP. It's an African COP. It's happening in a developing country. Sim, what are you realistically expecting to happen at COP27? What do you hope should happen? Because there's so much real and very justified disappointment about the broken promises of developed countries in terms of the support they promise to give to developing ones. What needs to happen at COP27 to really move things forward, in your opinion?
Simon, I would say that speaking about this from an African perspective, we would say that, we should try and emphasize a just transition as we think about climate change. We should try and make sure that the decisions taken address climate change and also support economic development. We need to make sure that as people think these principles through, they don't think of them as being in contradiction to one another, that they should run parallel and reinforce each other. I think we need to make sure that the just transition is understood in all its implications from a regional, country, and business perspective. If one thinks about our region, Simon, Africa must definitely join the global drive towards limiting greenhouse gas emissions, but that must also recognize and address the deep energy deficits across the African continent. So, for example, it's still the case that fewer than 50% of people in sub-Saharan Africa have access to grid electricity. And at a country and business level, the transition must create more decent jobs than it destroys. And most importantly, we must ensure that there are viable pathways between old jobs in carbon-intensive industries and new ones in more environmentally sustainable ones. We think at Standard Bank that Africa's recovery from the pandemic and its medium-term development both need this kind of openness by governments and businesses alike. And we have to focus on furthering investment in transitional activities. So in certain tightly defined circumstances, we want to remain open to supporting transitional energy and mining projects in Africa. And therefore, as people think about what to talk about at COP, this must be an important part of the agenda. We think that a refusal to accept this would amount to denying us Africans the right to sustainable development. Of course, Simon, you would know that over the past centuries, our beloved continent has borne very considerable economic and human costs for other regions, so that a total or a big ban on further transitional projects in Africa in order to help reduce environmental pressures in other parts of the world is just a cost too far. It's just not fair. But having said that, let me just emphasize that there's no doubt that the African continent must immediately reduce its reliance on carbon for energy, and it should decarbonize over the longer term. And Africa and the world at large, of course, must make a just transition to a sustainable model of energy production and economic development. The last point I would make as people frame the agenda would be to say that, as the largest player on the African continent, we would want to buttress all actions aligned to the Paris Agreement, and all energy must be focused on reinforcing the provisions of that wonderful agreement. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you very much, Sim. I think it was absolutely appropriate the way you emphasized this theme of justice, which is something that was high on the agenda at COP26, certainly will be at COP27. But Patrick, of course, justice comes up in a different context in countries like France with the Gilets jaunes movement. These protesters felt that it was unjust the extent to which they were having to pay more for their energy. And the fact is that it's perhaps not politically realistic to expect to achieve ambitious progress as long as you are not getting the support of people within the developed countries who are unhappy about things like energy costs. So what is a just transition going to look like in the French context? And what can the rest of the world learn from that Gilets jaunes movement and the conversation in France? What should we learn from this?
Alors, je ne sais pas si c'est une leçon qu'a donnée la France, mais c'est une alerte en tout cas. Écoutez, moi j'ai le souvenir, de citer cette anecdote, j'ai le souvenir d'une discussion absolument passionnante avec Monsieur Timmermans, qui est le commissaire européen à l'environnement, quelques mois après ce mouvement des Gilets jaunes, qui a failli déstabiliser la France à certains égards, y compris le pouvoir politique. Et j'avais été surpris et presque un peu choqué de sa part, alors que c'est un homme évidemment remarquablement intelligent, très à l'écoute. J'avais été choqué de l'entendre me répondre que finalement, ça n'était pas un sujet, cette affaire des Gilets jaunes. Pour moi, pour le mouvement des entreprises de France, c'est absolument fondateur parce qu'en avance de phase, d'une certaine manière, ça nous a alertés sur ce sujet central de l'acceptabilité. Alors, en regard, la seule solution, me semble-t-il, c'est de poser clairement les enjeux pour que personne, quel qu'il soit, un ménage, un entrepreneur, n'ait le soupçon qu'on lui dissimule quelque chose. Il faut dire les choses, il faut poser les choses, et il faut réunir les conditions d'un juste partage de l'effort. En l'état, l'effort va être très concentré, en définitive, sur deux catégories d'acteurs économiques, les ménages modestes. Typiquement, il y a une nouvelle loi en France qui impose dans les agglomérations de plus de 150 000 habitants ce qu'on appelle les zones à faible émission, c'est-à-dire qui interdit l'accès au centre-ville de véhicules qui ont des classements en termes de pollution défavorables. Ce sont les gens modestes qui sont équipés de ces véhicules. De la même manière, du côté des entrepreneurs, je les ai cités tout à l'heure, les industriels qui, à ce jour, travaillent dans la sous-traitance automobile pour le moteur thermique, alors même que l'Union européenne vient de confirmer qu'à partir de 2035, on ne pourrait plus vendre de véhicules thermiques en Europe. ni de véhicules hybrides, soit dit en passant, eh bien, ces personnes vont souffrir, ces entrepreneurs vont souffrir beaucoup plus que ceux qui sont dans le recyclage, dans les utilities, qui au contraire, eux, tireront parti de cette situation. Et donc, il nous appartient collectivement de chiffrer les choses, de voir où, à nouveau, l'effort sera le plus douloureux, et puis de réunir les financements qui permettront, le jour venu, sans précipitation, sans brutalité, d'accompagner ces personnes-là. Ça suppose donc qu'on constitue des réserves importantes sur le plan financier pour compenser en quelque sorte ces acteurs économiques dont je parlais, ménages, entrepreneurs, et afin d'éviter autant que possible qu'ils se mettent en opposition frontale, sans quoi nous ne pourrons pas avancer. Et pardon de terminer là-dessus, il y a aussi une logique territoriale. On a en Europe, mais je sais que c'est vrai à travers le monde, on a des spécialisations économiques, des spécialisations industrielles par territoire, et c'est une très bonne chose d'avoir des clusters, c'est ça qui permet de créer des dynamiques collectives. Mais certains territoires vont être plus touchés que d'autres. Si on parle de la France, par exemple, c'est le nord et l'est de la France où se concentre le plus l'industrie automobile. Eh bien, il va falloir, alors même que la France est beaucoup désindustrialisée et sait que ça a créé des fractures qui, même politiquement, peuvent créer de graves problèmes. On l'a vu dans le dernier vote, le vote d'extrême droite en France et le vote d'extrême gauche sont très concentrés, surtout le vote d'extrême droite, dans des territoires qui ont été très durement affectés par la disparition de certaines industries, parce qu'elles se sont délocalisées ou tout simplement parce qu'elles ont disparu. Donc il faut qu'on intègre également cette dimension territoriale, alors à l'échelle nationale, mais plus encore à l'échelle internationale, parce que sinon on va créer d'autres tensions qui ne sont pas à proprement parler économiques, mais qui elles aussi pourraient conduire à ce qu'on ne déroule pas en définitive ces stratégies environnementales qui sont pour le bien de tous.
Thank you so much, Patrick. There is so much more to discuss. Unfortunately, we're just about out of time. Just remains for me to thank all our panelists for a really excellent discussion. We managed to cover a lot. As I mentioned, there's still much more to cover, which I'm sure will be covered to a very good extent in the rest of the sessions here this week. Thank you again to all the panelists, and thank you everyone for watching both in person and online.